Welcome back to the Obby series. In today's episode, we're going to be creating the intro/loading screen for when users join our game, and it looks something like this. So, hopping right into Studio, let's get started with actually creating this. In order to begin creating this, we're first going to go ahead and create the screen GUI. Before we begin creating the GUI though, let's make sure that we do have device emulation enabled so that it's a lot easier for us to actually create the GUI. So we're going to go to the Test tab, enable device emulation. I would recommend going with the 1080 as we normally do, and now we're ready to start working on the GUI. So inside of the starter GUI, we're going to go ahead and create a brand new screen GUI, which we're going to rename to be called loading. Then inside of here, we're going to go ahead and add in a canvas group. The specific reason that we're using a canvas group here instead of, say, a frame, for example, is because of the group transparency property. With the group transparency property, every child that we add inside of the canvas group will be affected by this property. So I just added in a text label, for example, and we can see the small little square, which is our canvas group at the top left-hand corner of our screen. And now if I go ahead and adjust the group transparency from 0 to 1, we can see it sort of fading out and eventually becoming invisible, and everything inside of it becomes invisible as well, including the text label. So the primary reason that we're actually using the canvas group is because it's a lot easier to work with when it comes to animations, or at least the specific animation that we kind of want to create. And with that being said, I'm going to reset the group transparency back to 0, and I'll also remove the text label that we put inside of there as well. Now, with the canvas group, we're going to want to go ahead and first adjust the size, and we're going to want this canvas group to take up the entire screen. So on both the X and the Y axis on the scale, we're going to go ahead and set that to 1. Then for the background color, let's go ahead and use our usual blue. Now, we're going to have only two things inside of this canvas group. One is going to be a text label, and the other is actually going to be a progress bar, which we've created plenty of times in the past. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab one of the progress bars that we've created previously, and I'm going to go ahead and grab it from the Rebirth GUI. So inside of here, we have the frame, and inside of the frame, we have a title frame, which inside of the title frame has a title text label, and then we also have a progress bar canvas group inside of here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and select the progress bar canvas group, and I'm also going to select the title text label, and then I'll go ahead and copy both of them by hitting Control C, and I'll paste them into the canvas group by selecting the canvas group and then hitting Control Shift and V to paste them inside of the canvas group. Now that we've done that, let's first start off by adjusting the title text label. First, we'll go ahead and update the text of this. I'm going to say something like, "Welcome to the super simple Obby!" And then I'm also going to adjust the text size of this as well to make it larger. So for the text size, I think I'm going to go with about a 92, but of course, feel free to adjust it to whatever you'd like. Since we've increased the size though, I'm also going to want to increase the UI stroke to this as well. And I'm probably going to go from 5 to maybe about 8. And then I'll actually adjust the size of the text label from taking up the entire height and width to something a little bit smaller. On the X-axis, we're still going to use the scale property, but this time we're going to set it to about 0.8. so that it takes up about 80% of the width. And then for the height, we're going to set the scale property to 0, but for the offset, we're going to go with something like 60. And now we can see how that looks, and that looks pretty fine for the sizing. Now we are going to adjust the positioning, but we'll actually do that once we sort of finish updating the progress bar. So moving on to the progress bar, what we first want to do is adjust the sizing of this. And we're going to increase the sizing, at least for the width, from 550 all the way up to 1000 pixels. Then for the height of this, we're going to increase that just a little bit, so we're going to go from 50 all the way up to 80. And then we're going to take a look inside of the progress bar, and then we're actually going to delete the amount text label. And for the progress inside of here, we're going to increase the width of this to say something like 0.5. And the only reason that we're doing that is just for us to take a look at how the progress bar actually looks when it's about 50% filled. The size of the progress frame doesn't actually matter when it comes to the player's perspective. We're only doing this so that we can kind of see what the green looks like over top of the white, along with all of the other colors, and just kind of see what this will actually look like. Now with it being said, since again we did increase the size of the progress bar, let's go ahead and also increase the size of the UI stroke as well. So currently this is 5. Let's go ahead and increase this about the same amount that we increased for the text label. So we're going to go from 5 to about 8. And now we're pretty much finished with resizing both the progress bar and the title text label, so let's go ahead and position them. And to position them, we're actually going to use a UI list layout. Now, in order to position these, we basically want them to both be centered horizontally and vertically, so in the middle of our screen, and we can easily do that with the UI list layout. So go into the UI list layout, we want to modify some of the alignment properties. So for the horizontal alignment, we're going to change that from left over to center. And then for vertical alignment, we're going to change that from top to center as well. Now that we have both of those centered, let's go ahead and adjust the padding between them. And we're going to use the offset here. And the offset is really up to you. You could do something like 50, which I think is pretty nice, but maybe you want them to be spread a little bit more apart. So maybe 75, maybe 100, or maybe you want them to be a little bit closer. So I was going to say 25, but I think 25 is is honestly too close. Like 40 almost feels like the minimum that you'd want to go, but I think I'm going to go with 50 because that seems like a pretty good number, and I think the alignment looks pretty good as well. Now we've done all of that, taking a look at this GUI, it does look pretty nice in my opinion, so I'd say we're pretty much finished with creating this. Now there's still about 2 more things that we need to do with the screen GUI itself. First, we want to go ahead and add in a UI scale to this, so let's just go ahead and grab one of the UI scales that we've created for our other GUIs and paste that inside of here, and then we want to modify some properties of the screen GUI itself as well. So the first property that we're going to modify is the display order. Currently, this is 0, and if we take a look at pretty much all of our other screen GUIs, the display order property is 0 for all of them as well. Now for the loading screen GUI, we're going to set the loading order to a very high number, and we want this number to be so high that it's guaranteed to be higher than the display order of every other GUI. So if I was to modify the display order of any other GUIs, I would probably use lower numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 10, and different things like that. So for this display order of the loading screen GUI, I can set it to about 999 and guarantee that I won't go over that ever. But if you do numbers a little bit differently, then maybe you want to make this an even larger number. It really doesn't matter. You just pretty much want to guarantee that this display order is higher than every single other screen GUI's display order as well. And the reason for that is because this is the loading screen, and we want this screen GUI to appear over top of every other screen GUI element that is displayed to the player. If something like, say, the left screen GUI, which displays some on-screen buttons that the player could click, is displayed over top of our loading screen, that wouldn't really look right. So that's why we want to make sure that the display order is higher for this screen GUI than all of our other screen GUIs. In addition to that, we also want to make sure that the ignore GUI inset is set to true so that this appears over top of the entire screen. And like usual, we want to set the reset on spawn property to false because we don't ever want it to reset. Now, one more thing that we actually want to do is modify the screen insets property. And I believe that this property, or at least most of the device safe area properties, usually have to do with specific handheld devices. One way that we can easily visualize this is by actually changing our device emulation from the standard desktop over to something like the iPhone 14 Pro. When we change it to the iPhone 14 Pro, we can actually see that our GUI on both the left and the right is not actually being displayed in those specific areas. And that is because of the screen insets property. So by default, the screen insets property should be set to device safe insets. But what we want to do is set this to none in order to force our screen GUI to be displayed over top of the player's entire screen. Now you might be thinking, wait a second, doesn't our screen GUI look really weird right now? And yes, it does look really weird, but remember, because of how we have our GUIs actually set up and how we have the scaling set up, the scaling only happens when we go into our game and begin testing this out. So I mean, actually, we could literally start up our game, and then once we start up our game, we can see what this looks like in the game, and we can see that this is actually being displayed over top of the entire screen. So that's why we want to modify the insets property as we just did. Anyways, now that we've done that, I'm going to go back to our original device emulation, which is 1920 by 1080. And with all that being said, we are actually finished with creating this GUI. But now there's actually one more thing that we want to do with this GUI, and that is move it from the starter GUI into a different service. And the specific service that we want to move the screen GUI into is actually the replicated first service, which we have not worked with yet. Now, what the replicated first service actually is it is a service that we can use in order to store different things like scripts, screen GUIs, or anything else that you want to be instantly replicated to the player as soon as they join the game, before everything else is sent to the player as well. So for instance, when the player joins the game for the first time, every single thing inside of the starter GUI, inside of the starter player, inside of the starter pack, all of that will be replicated to the client. Even things inside of the replicated storage as well, and the workspace, of course. But there's one service, which is the replicated first service, which actually anything that's stored inside of here will be replicated to the client before anything else from any of these other services are actually replicated to the client as well. So that's why we're going to use the replicated first service in order for us to actually make the loading screen when the player joins the game for the very first time. So in addition to just storing the screen GUI inside of here, we also are going to want to create a local script inside of here in order for us to begin scripting this as well. And keep in mind that it's important that you create a local script because we've been structuring our entire game around the module framework that we've been using, but the module framework is not compatible with the replicated first. So that's why we want to create a local script inside of the replicated first so that this script actually runs. If we were to just just put a module script inside of the replicated first, then that script would never run because module scripts don't just run by themselves. Again, the reason that we've been able to do it this entire time is because the module framework, how we've had it set up, will require all of our module scripts like services and controllers and other things like that. Anyways, now that we've created the script inside of here, let's go ahead and rename this to be called intro. I've been kind of flip-flopping on the name of what I actually call this feature. Sometimes I refer to it as the intro. Maybe that's just the YouTube part of my brain going off, and then other times I refer to it as the loading screen. But we're going to go ahead and call the script intro, and then we'll go ahead and call the screen GUI loading, or you can feel free to use whatever naming scheme you like if you feel comfortable with doing that. Anyways, to begin scripting, towards the top of our script, we're going to want to require a couple of different services. So the first service that we're going to want to get is the player service. On top of that, we're also going to want to get the replicated storage. We're also going to want to get the starter GUI. And then finally, we're also going to want to get the tween service as well. Now that we've done that, we're going to want to go ahead and create a variable for the local player. So we're going to say players.localPlayer. Now that we've gotten the local player, we want to go ahead and create a variable for the player GUI, which is stored inside of the player. So we're going to say player GUI equals player. Then we'll use the wait for child method and we'll wait for the player GUI to become available. In addition to the player GUI, we also want to get the player scripts from the player object as well. So we'll go ahead and say player, wait for child, player scripts. And now let's go ahead and start creating some variables for the actual GUI itself. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called GUI. Okay, I made a mistake already. So annoying. I hate making mistakes, but I also don't feel like going back through and just like re-editing all this. Instead of the replicate storage, we actually have to require the replicated first service. So my bad about that. Let's go ahead and update that variable. And now we can actually create a variable for the GUI. So we're going to go ahead and say replicated first dot loading to get the screen GUI. Then let's create a variable for the canvas group. So we'll say GUI dot canvas group. And then let's also create a variable for the progress bar. So we'll go ahead and say canvas group dot progress bar just like that. Then what we're going to want to do is create a variable called state manager. And we're not going to set that to anything yet. And in addition to that, we also want to create a variable called is loaded. And for right now, we're going to go ahead and set that to false. Okay, so now that we've created all of those variables, the first thing that we're going to do is actually try to require the state manager. And the state manager is actually one of the ways which we're going to determine if the player has finished loading or not. Because how our loading process is going to work is for us to know that the player has finished loading in. That means that the player's data has been replicated from the server down to the client, and all of the GUIs have actually been updated to reflect the player's data. So for instance, once the state manager has actually been loaded, the GUI at the top, which says the stage that the player is currently on, that GUI will actually be updated to reflect the actual stage that the player is currently on. But before the state manager is loaded, the only thing that this GUI will display is stage 50, 50%, and that amount of progress that is displayed right there currently. So that's why we want to wait for the state manager to be loaded, and we're using that as one of the methods to determine if the player has finished loading in or not. So what we're going to do is use a task.spawn, and the reason that we're doing that is in order to prevent the logic that we write inside of here from stalling this script, aka stopping at this moment, because we actually have to wait for the state controller to become available to us. That might sound confusing, but you'll see exactly what I mean in a minute. So inside of the task.spawn, let's create an anonymous function, and now what we want to do is set the state manager variable to the actual state controller. And we can do that by saying require. Then we're going to go inside of the player scripts. Then we'll use the wait for child method. And now this is why we're actually using a task.spawn, because when we use wait for child, this will actually stall the script and stop the script from continue running and all of the logic that's below this until the child has actually been found. So the child that we want to wait for inside of the player script is called controllers. And then from the controllers folder, we can go ahead and wait for the state controller module to be found as well. And that's how we can get the player state manager. Now to determine if the player state has actually been replicated to the client, what we're going to do is update the isLoaded variable, and we're just going to set that to the state manager.getState. Because remember, when we use the getState function, that will actually cause the script to stall as well. And the only time that something is returned from getState is if the player state has actually been received. So that's when the isLoaded variable will be changed when the player state has actually been received. So, like I said, this is one way of determining if the player's game has fully finished loading. But now after this, we're going to go ahead and create a function, which is going to be called loading loop. And it's not going to have any parameters. Now, the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and create a variable called progress. And effectively, to the player, what we're doing is actually displaying a fake progress bar. The reason for that is because there's not really a specific way for us to determine what percentage of the way the player is to finish loading. So we're going to kind of make up our own progress amount and just gaslight the player into thinking either they're very slow loading or maybe they're even very fast loading. It doesn't really matter. Either way, we're lying to the player and they will never ever know unless you share this video with them, which you shouldn't share this video with them. Don't let this secret out of the bag. Otherwise, you will ruin so many games on Roblox. Anyway, like I said, we're going to be making this number up. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the math.random function and we're going to get a number between 1 and 10. Then we're going to go ahead and divide that by 100 in order to get a decimal. So effectively, our progress percentage is going to start between 1 and 10%. Then we're going to use a task.spawn once again. And like I said before, the only reason that we actually use task.spawns is to prevent scripts from stalling. So you'll probably realize exactly why we're doing this in just a minute. Anyways, inside of here, we're going to want to go ahead and update the size of the progress bar. So we're going to say progress bar dot progress dot size equals, then we'll say udim2 dot from scale. And for the x scale, we'll go ahead and use the progress variable. And then for the y scale, we'll of course use 1. Next, what we're going to do is create a while loop. And we're going to want this while loop to run while the player has not finished loading. Now remember, we already know one way of determining if the player's game has fully finished loading or not, and that is by using the isLoaded variable. So we're going to say while not isLoaded, and there's another way of determining if the player's game has actually finished loading, and that's by using a method which belongs to the game data model. And the method that we want to use is called isLoaded. And if we look at the description of this method, it says returns true if the client has finished loading the game for the first time. Now, that might sound vague or not very helpful, and I don't think that my explanation of this is going to be too much more helpful, but in the official documentations, what it says is that game is loaded will return true once all initial instances in the game have finished replicating to the client. So while I'm not 100% sure if this is actually accurate, my thought process from hearing that is that this will be returned true once everything that should be replicated to the player, like everything inside of the replicated storage, everything inside of the workspace that's within the player's streaming distance, everything inside of the starter's UI, the starter pack, the starter player, and all those different things, I think that those are all referred to as the initial instances that need to be replicated to the player in order for this to be returned true. Now, I don't know if that's technically 100% correct, but I think that's at least a fair way of thinking about it. Now, with that being said, I actually kind of messed this for loop up a little bit because we actually want this while loop to run while either of these are false. So first, when our player's state has not been loaded, or not when the game has been loaded as well. So then we can say do and create this while loop. So while the game is not loaded, what we're going to do is actually increase the progress bar. Now, first we're going to create a variable called max increase, because what we're going to do is actually slow down the amount that we increase the progress by once the player reaches a specific threshold. So what I mean by that is we're going to say if the progress is greater than or equal to 70, then the maximum that we can increase the player's progress by is 1. But otherwise, if we're not at 70% yet, then the max that we can increase the progress bar by is 3% each time. And the reason that we're doing that is because if the progress reaches 70, and the player's data has still not been fully loaded yet, then the player just might have a slow connection. So we're going to decrease the maximum amount that we can increase the progress by every single half second, because that's how frequently we're going to increase the progress in order to prevent the progress from reaching 100% before the player has actually finished loading. So now that we've created that variable, let's go ahead and actually update the progress variable. And to update the progress variable, we're going to use the math.min function, which is going to return the smallest number among the numbers that we give to this function. And now what we're going to pass through this function is progress. Then we're going to add math.random, and we're going to generate a number between 1 and max increase. And then we'll go ahead and divide that by 100. Then we're actually going to cap the progress out at 85%. And the reason that we're doing that is in order to prevent the progress from going over 85, again, in case the player's progress is very slow. You could even increase this a little bit if you want to say anything from like 85% to 95%. We're just really wanting to prevent the player from reaching 100% before their data and game has actually been fully loaded. So now that we've updated the progress variable, let's go ahead and actually update the size of the progress bar. So we're going to say progress bar dot progress. And now rather than using the tween service like we normally would, we can actually use a method on this called tween size, which by the description of this smoothly resizes a GUI to a new udim2. So effectively, we're tweening the progress bar, but rather than using the entire tween service like we normally would, we can easily just use this method. Now, the first thing that we need to do is pass through the new size that we want to tween to. So we're going to say udim2 dot from scale. Then we're going to go ahead and pass through the brand new progress for the X and then 1 for the Y scale. Then for the second argument, we want to pass through the easing direction. So we're going to say enum.easing direction, and then we'll use the out direction. And then for the easing style, we're going to go with linear. And then we can also specify how many seconds this tween should take, and we're going to go ahead and say 1 second. Then after this, we're going to use a task.wait as we want to anytime we use a while loop, and we're going to go ahead and update the progress every half second. So that's why we're going to say task.wait 0.5. Then we're going to go outside of that while loop, but still inside of the task.spawn. And once we're outside of the while loop and we're down this far, this actually means that the player's game has been loaded. So what do we want to do once the player's game has fully been loaded? Well, we want to go ahead and tween the progress bar from whatever it's currently at to 100%. And then once we finish tweening the progress bar to 100%, we then want to go ahead and tween the group transparency property of the canvas group to sort of fade the loading screen GUI out. So let's go ahead and do that. First, we're going to go ahead and create a variable called tweenInfo. So we'll say tweenInfo.new. For the amount of time that this will take, we'll say 1 second. For the style, we'll of course go ahead and use linear. And then for the easing direction, we'll go ahead and use out. Then we'll go ahead and create a variable called tweenProps, which is going to be equal to a blank table. Then we'll use tweenProps to specify the specific property that we want to update, which is the size property. And then what do we want to set the new size to? Well, we'll go ahead and use a udim2. We'll say from scale. And because we want to display 100% in the progress bar, we're going to go ahead and use 1 for the X scale and 1 for the Y scale as well. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and create the actual tween. So we'll say tween service, create. What do we want to tween? Well, we want to tween the progress frame inside of the progress bar. Then we can pass through the tween info, and then we can pass through the tween props as well. Now that we've created the tween, let's go ahead and use it. So we'll say tween play. And then we actually want to stall the script until the tween finishes playing. So we'll go ahead and say tween.completed wait. And that'll actually stall right there until that tween has been completed. Now, once that tween has been completed, like I said, let's go ahead and tween the group transparency property of the canvas group to fade the GUI out. So first, let's go ahead and actually reset the tweenProps variable back to a blank table. Then let's add the specific property that we want to modify inside of the tweenProps table. So we'll say tweenProps.groupTransparency equals, and we want to move the group transparency to 1. Then let's go ahead and create a brand new tween. So we'll go ahead and say tween service, create. This time we want to go ahead and tween the canvas group. And then we'll go ahead and pass through the tween info as well as the tween props. And now that we've created the tween, let's go ahead and play it. So we'll go ahead and say tween, play. And now we actually want to wait for this to be finished as well. So once again, we'll go ahead and say tween.completed, wait, because we want to wait for that tween to be finished. And then once that tween is finished, we can actually go ahead and simply destroy the GUI. Now, with that being said, we're actually fully finished with creating this entire function. So let's go outside of this function all the way down towards the very bottom of the script, and let's go ahead and use the function. So we'll go ahead and say loading loop, just like that. But now, before this function's called, we actually want to do a couple of things. First, we're going to use the replicated first service because it has a method on it called remove default loading screen, which, as the name of this method kind of gives off, it'll literally remove Roblox's default loading screen from the game. And this is good because we're now creating our own loading screen, which we'll be using to replace Roblox's default one. Now, another thing that we can do to sort of improve this a little bit is use a method of the starter GUI, which is called set core GUI enabled. And what this allows us to do is turn off certain Roblox GUI elements. So for the first argument, Roblox wants us to pass through the specific core GUI type that we want to enable or disable. So we're going to say enum.core GUI type. And to make this easy, we're going to go ahead and actually disable all of them. But realistically, at least in our scenario, the only one that we actually care about is the player list. So I don't think that this will actually cause any issues or anything like that. But if it does, or you realize something, or maybe you just don't like it, you can definitely just specify which ones you want to disable, like the player list. You might also want to disable the emotes menu, probably the chat as well, and maybe self-view. I think self-view is like that new thing that Roblox added in recently, which kind of displays the camera at the top left-hand corner of your screen. Although I have no idea if that's what self-view actually is, but that's just the first thing that came to mind when I thought of it. And this enum doesn't actually have a description to it, so I'm not 100% sure. But anyway, you should be perfectly fine by disabling all of them because we're actually going to re-enable all of them once the GUI is finished as well, and we'll do that in just a minute. But we also want to pass through a second argument to this function, and we want to go ahead and pass through false because that actually tells this function that we want to disable all of these GUIs. So now that we're disabling all those GUIs, like I said, we're going to re-enable all of them. So inside of this function, after we destroy the GUI, so after the entire loading process has finished, let's go ahead and re-enable all of those core GUIs. So this time we'll just go ahead and pass through true instead of false, and that'll re-enable all of those GUIs. Then there's one more thing that we need to do, and this is also one of the most important things, and that is actually reparenting the GUI from the replicated first service to the player GUI. So we'll go ahead and say GUI.parent, and then we'll set the parent of the GUI to player GUI before we even begin the loading loop function. The reason that we need to do this is because by default, we store the GUI inside of the replicated first. But the only way for GUIs to actually be rendered and displayed to the player is if they're stored inside of the player GUI. So that's why we have to move it from the replicated first over to the player GUI before we even start animating it or doing anything with it, because otherwise the player just won't even be able to see the GUI as it's still stored inside of the replicated first. And now, with all that being said, we're actually fully finished with writing out this entire script. So what we can do is go into our game and test this out. And now, once we get into our game, we can see that this is actually working and being displayed to us. Now, I'm going to restart the game, but as we're kind of loading in, we can see that actually, for example, when we disabled some of the core GUIs, we can saw that the leader stats wasn't appearing at the beginning until the loading screen actually went away. So that was one good example of disabling Roblox's GUIs. Unfortunately, though, one of the GUIs that we're not able to disable is the ones towards the top left. Roblox pretty much forces us to keep those displayed at the top left, and it kind of makes sense. I think Roblox wants to kind of prevent players from basically being able to prevent players from like leaving their game. So I think Roblox keeps the logo at the top left as sort of a standard for all players to kind of know where they can go in case any weird stuff is happening in the game. But another thing that you probably notice is with the loading screen, this loading, the progress bar is not being displayed correctly. I think that I've mentioned this before, but that is actually a Roblox engine bug which needs to be fixed on Roblox's end. There's not really anything that we can do. It's not like we're using it incorrectly or anything like that. That is a legitimate Roblox issue that they need to fix on their end. But there is a little bit of a band-aid solution which was found by one of my amazing testers known as Obby, and I'll leave a link down below in the description to the post I made on my website about this, explaining how to use this solution. Now, I'm really not happy with doing this because it's going to make our code a little bit sloppy, but what we're going to do to try to fix this, and I'm not sure if this is a 100% guarantee, that might sound a little bit annoying to you, and trust me, I totally get it, but at the same time, I put a good amount of responsibility on Roblox to fix and sort this bug out. Canvas groups are a really useful tool that we should be able to use, and we shouldn't have to do very hacky things like this because there's kind of a devastating bug that basically ruins using canvas groups. So hopefully by the time you're seeing this, maybe you don't even encounter this bug. If you're able to start your game and you don't encounter this bug, then you could just skip over this part and you're finished with this. But if you are encountering this bug where the canvas group and the progress bar is not really being displayed, then you might have to try to use this sort of hacky solution. Anyways, the sort of solution that we're going to use is by first parenting the progress bar from where it's currently parented at into the player GUI service. Then we're going to use task.wait, and we're going to wait a single second, and then we'll go ahead and reparent the progress bar from the player GUI back into the canvas group where it was originally stored at. And we're only doing this a single time when the loading loop function is called for the very first time. We're not even doing this inside of the while loop, so realistically, the player should not even really have any noticeable visual difference for the most part. And I'll show you exactly what I mean by starting up our game. So once we start up our game, we can see that that looks and works all perfectly, and we are actually able to see the progress bar. But I'm going to restart my game once again because I'm not sure how clear it was. But so like for a second there, the progress bar isn't being displayed. It's only the text label that's being displayed. And then you can kind of see that the progress bar is added in after that. But in my opinion, the difference really isn't that major. It's not super noticeable or anything like that. And it's also a very simple thing, which solves a pretty devastating issue. So I'm perfectly fine with it looking like that for just a split second when the player sees it, rather than dealing with the progress bar just not being displayed to the player at all. I think that's a perfectly fine solution to accept. Again, though, I do apologize for that being an issue. Unfortunately, Roblox has been extremely snail speed when it comes to fixing this issue, and I'll leave a link down below in the description to the developer forum post where this issue has actually been sent to Roblox at so that you can see it for yourself and see if any progress has actually been made. But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you did enjoy, make sure you smash the like button. Please leave a comment down below letting other people know that it did work. I and they really do appreciate it. It helps everyone out. And as usual, if you want to gain access to all the scripts and the game file that we made during this episode, as well as a ton of other assets, you can visit MonzterDev or my Patreon, link down below in the description to both of these. You can gain access to a ton of assets to easily create your next Roblox game, as well as support me in creating all the content that I create. Anyways, with all that being said, I hope that you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.